Kevin Kamps from Beyond Nuclear drops by to talk about how 300 million gallons of radioactive water could end up in the Pacific Ocean. Check this out. Leave your comments, dig the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel.
2021, incredibly enough, will mark 10 years since the beginning of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear catastrophe in Japan. So what happened on March 11th of 2011 was initiated by a 9.0 earthquake off the coast, which sent a 45-foot tall tsunami into the nuclear power plant. And what resulted over the next few days was the meltdown of 3 of the 6 reactors at that site, followed by large-scale explosions and a catastrophic release of hazardous radioactivity to the environment. And here we are 10 years later, and they are still working hard over there, thousands of workers, to try to put a lid on the situation. So fortunately, the large-scale releases that took place over weeks, months, even years after the beginning of this catastrophe have dwindled to some extent. There are still radioactive releases for sure, but some of the shoes that could still drop at Fukushima Daiichi include more than 1 million tons of highly radioactive wastewater, which is something like 300 million gallons of highly radioactive wastewater that have accumulated over the past 10 years. And unfortunately, learning no lessons, the Japanese government, Tokyo Electric Power Company, with some American advisors, are talking about dumping that wastewater into the ocean, an intentional, conscious pollution of the Pacific Ocean with highly radioactive wastewater. That's what's being proposed.
So what's the consequence of that? I mean, the ocean's a big place, right? Doesn't that dilute all that radioactive water?
Well, folks like Dr. Rosalie Bertel pointed out that dilution is not the solution to radioactive pollution, because what's going to happen is that tritium, it's mostly tritium, but there are other radioactive poisons in that wastewater, will reconcentrate. It will bioaccumulate, biomagnify up the food chain, and humans are at the top of the food chain. So guess who is leading the opposition to this intentional dump? It is the fishing cooperatives of Japan, who've already been so devastated by this nuclear catastrophe. But this would be the final blow to their livelihoods, because people will avoid that seafood that's caught there.
Can you explain bioaccumulation, please?
Well, it's where small organisms are eaten by larger organisms, and the radioactivity builds up in concentration as larger and larger organisms eat it, ingest it. And so humans would get the worst of those doses, unfortunately.
So they pour, the water itself is not radioactive. It's contaminated with radioactive compounds. They pour that water into the ocean. It gets diluted. It's fairly spread out. Algae absorb these things. Plants of various kinds will absorb these things because some of these elements, like strontium, they think it's calcium. Cesium, radioactive cesium, they think it's potassium. Correct me if I'm wrong at any point on this. And
no, you're right. The only thing I would mention that you had just said was that it's not radioactive water, and you're right. Strontium and cesium are contaminants in that wastewater. But incredibly, tritium, radioactive hydrogen, it is radioactive water. The hydrogen atoms in the water molecules themselves contain tritium. So in that sense, it is radioactive water. And it can't be filtered. That's the point. It's so small on the periodic table that at industrial scale, they can't filter it. They could in a lab. So really the solution to this problem that they have, this burgeoning collection of wastewater, is to let it decay. Luckily, tritium has a shorter half-life of 12.3 years. So if it's stored for a century or so, it's mostly going to decay away with time.
Right. Half-life means after 12.3 years, half of the radioactivity is gone. At 12.3 years later, a quarter of the we're down to a quarter. 12.3 years after that, we're down to an eighth. Do I have that right?
Right, and usually 10 half-lives is considered the hazardous persistence, but to be safe, you should go out to 20. So for tritium, 10 half-lives would be 123 years, but if you were able to store it for 250 years, then you'd be safer. There'd be less tritium.
Right. So these plants are absorbing these compounds thinking that they're calcium and phosphorus, which they need just like we do. Small fish eat the plants, and they absorb this into the tissue of their bodies. Medium-sized fish eat the small fish, and they absorb that into their bodies and keep it and hold it. Then bigger fish eat the medium-sized fish, and then we come along and we catch the big fish. This is how iodine, radioactive iodine, from burning coal goes into the air and ends up, in the ocean, and that's how tuna got filled with radioactive iodine or mercury. I'm sorry, with mercury. And, it's the same process, this bioaccumulation. It's just mind-boggling. Anyhow, we're talking with Kevin Kamps. He's the nuclear waste specialist at beyondnuclear.org. I want to get into what the state of nuclear power is in the United States, where we've got problems, what we're doing about storage. There's a whole bunch of issues here. Stick around. We're going to do a deep dive into the U.S. and nuclear power.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And nuclear weapons. We'll be right back with Kevin Kamps. Beyondnuclear.org is the